Alright, hello everyone and welcome to NFL Discussion. I'm your host, NFL enthusiast Dougie Doug. In today's episode, I'm going to be discussing Thursday Night Football Week 14 of the 2022 NFL season. So in this game, you had a Raiders team coming off a 3-game winning streak, and then you have a Rams team that a couple days ago, well, they got lucky. They got lucky that a quarterback like Baker Mayfield was made available via waivers for them to claim, so they did just that. They put in a claim, they got Baker Mayfield, and 2 days later, after like one possession, he's out there on the field starting this game for the Rams, and wouldn't you know it, they pull off an improbable last-minute win with Baker as their quarterback. And honestly, that is the NFL at its finest. Sometimes it's not flashy offense, sometimes it's just slow, methodical football that features a lot of defense before the offense does something crazy at the end to get a win. And with that, we're going to get right into the action, starting with the Raiders. So Derek Carr completed 11 of 20 passes for 137 yards, no touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. So Carr would start the game with 2 long completions to Davante Adams, which set up the Josh Jacobs rushing touchdown on the opening possession. He would then proceed to struggle for much of the remainder of the game, as the Raiders managed only field goals the rest of the way. His biggest mistake perhaps came at the end of the first half when he threw an ill-advised red zone interception on the ball he tried to force over the middle. That pick, probably one of the worst red zone interceptions of the season, and it also cost the team at the very minimum 3 points. Which ultimately proved costly in the 1-point defeat. What's more, the loss has all but eliminated the Raiders from playoff contention after the team had just rattled off a 3-game win streak to try to keep themselves in contention. Carr has 10 days now to prepare for a difficult matchup with the Patriots in Week 15. Now, it should be noted that mathematically speaking, they are still alive, but there's a difference between being a mathematical contender and being an actual contender, and the Raiders are not an actual contender. That's why I threw in the towel on their season. What week was that? Give me a second. Week 9. Yeah. So the Raiders basically had this game won. They were up 16-3 midway through the fourth quarter, and it appeared that they were about to win their fourth straight game, and suddenly make that Week 15 matchup with the Patriots a little bit more interesting, as it could have been a possible elimination game between mentor Bill Belichick and mentee Josh McDaniels, or student Josh McDaniels. But just as the Saints, or just as the Buccaneers did against the Saints Monday night, the Saints against the Buccaneers on Monday night, just like the Raiders did in this game, took the foot off the gas, played conservative. You think about the first possession of the fourth quarter, up 10 points, they were conservative, settled for a field goal. Okay, interesting decision. Up 6 to 3 minutes left, they played predictable, conservative, handed it off 3 times to an overworked and probably very tired Josh Jacobs, and even a depleted defense can stop that. But perhaps most intriguing and most wild was how aggressive they were against Mayfield on the final drive, continuing to stick with press man coverage and not shifting or trying a zone or at least bail technique. Yeah, the dude did join the team like 2 days ago, but I mean, showing the guys zero respect on the final drive, well, you paid for that, and possibly the playoffs, possibly your spot in the playoffs as well too, or your spot or your opportunity to remain contenders, probably went with it. Maybe the Raiders are who we thought they were before the win streak, which to me, since week 9, I thought of them as pretenders. And speaking of Josh Jacobs, well, his toughness, it's admirable, but, there is some cause for concern about the Raiders potentially running him into the ground. Through 13 games, he's carried the ball 269 times, catching 44 passes as well, for a grand total of 314 touches, which is a league high. So in the previous 5 NFL seasons, that number's only been achieved 21 times by running backs. Jacobs in his career never come close to that. He's already set his career high in touches, and there's still 4 games left. He carried the ball 18 times in the first half, 4 days after he had 14 carries in the second half of a game against the Chargers. Now, Jacobs would leave this game with a hand injury. He did make his return, although that hand injury did kind of give him trouble early on. Ahead of him hitting free agency, I guess the question is, Fred asked, are the Raiders running this guy into the ground? Most likely, yes, it sure does look that way, but they need him, and he's played well, and hopefully he can stay healthy down the stretch. I'll say this, I've never been a fan of workhorse running backs. I'm opposed to workhorse running backs. I don't believe any team should have a workhorse running back. I think you should have two guys at running back, just because you want to keep your main guy, you want to keep his legs as fresh and healthy as you can, and when you're giving him like 20 plus carries a game, that dude, he's gonna break down, and you might take some years off the end of his career as well too. So something to keep in mind. And as for the Raiders, there is a lot of talk about them not being a playoff team and everything else. And here's the thing I'll say about the Raiders. When Josh McDaniels was hired, he was hired of a high expectation job. That expectation being that this team, with the roster that they had, or the roster that Dave Ziegler put together, that they were going to be playoff contenders. They were that last season, and that was the expectation going into this season, that Josh McDaniels, along with Derek Carr, and the rest of this team, would basically be playoff contenders. They'd be fighting the Chiefs for the AFC West crown. Neither of those things are happening. There was some earlier chatter in the year about McDaniels being one and done. And I think ultimately what's more likely to happen is Derek Carr ends up being the one gone. The Raiders are going to change something if they don't make the postseason. I don't think that means firing a coach after one season. I think that means cutting ties with Derek Carr. He's been there longer, and also I don't think the cap hit to remove him is one that would hurt the team in a negative way. So I think definitely towards the end of the season we'll have to see how the end of the season plays out. Maybe Derek Carr and Josh McDaniels put together a good enough performance towards the end to where they can both keep their job for next season, but I think it's more likely that Derek Carr ends up losing his job at the end of the year. Moving on to the Rams. Baker Mayfield completed 22 of 35 passes for 230 yards and 1 touchdown. So Mayfield didn't start the game, instead coming in after the team's first possession, a 3-and-out led by John Wolford. Baker would then enter the game on the second possession and play the rest of the way, leading 2 touchdown drives in the final 3:19 to get the come-from-behind victory. It wasn't all pretty for Mayfield in this game, as he looked, well, like Baker Mayfield for over 3 quarters of play, routinely throwing balls short or overcoming receivers along the sideline. That said, he somehow created enough magic to lead 2 long touchdown drives in the closing minutes of the game, the final of which went for 98 yards. Baker made 3 huge throws to keep the final drive alive, capping off the drive of a 23-yard breadbasket dime to Van Jefferson for the win. And the Rams they've long been out of playoff contention. Mathematically speaking, they're still alive, but they're right at the bottom. So eliminations are already happening, and I imagine that the Raiders are probably next to be eliminated from playoff contention. But yeah, and this was a nice little feel-good win. Baker and the Rams got to play spoiler, and certainly set the Rams back, or set the Raiders back. So now with this win, they'll have a full 11 days to prepare for a Monday Night Football matchup with the Packers. So gives Baker even more time to in the offense, see what he can do. And speaking of Mayfield, there might be an opportunity for him to thrive with Sean McVay, enjoy that career resurgence he was supposed to have after leaving Cleveland. The expectation with Matthew Stafford is that he will be sidelined the rest of the season. Stafford, he had his moment in the sun last season with that Super Bowl victory, but this season for the Rams and Stafford has been a disappointment to say the least. And speaking of disappointment, Mayfield himself has had a down season this year. Things did not work out in Cleveland. They moved on to get Deshaun Watson, ended up trading Mayfield to the Panthers. Things did not work out with the Panthers, and thus he was waived and found himself, he was a starter. He played terrible. I can't remember if he got injured and then he was benched, or if he got benched. I know he did get injured, but I can't quite remember the exact order. But either way, he ended up losing the starting job, and then then I think he found his way back onto the field after P.J. Walker got injured, and then I think pretty much he had like a second chance, blew the second chance, then basically got told by the Panthers that, hey, you're going to be the third string guy, you're going to be inactive. He asked to be released, he got released, and now he found himself a chance to be a starter the rest of the way for the Rams. Now, Matthew Stafford, right, assuming everything checks out with his health, he'll be back next year as a starter for the Rams, but perhaps Mayfield could return as a backup in LA next year, and honestly, that might not be the worst thing for him. Now, granted, that would be dependent on his performance over the next 4 games, which, depending on how said performance goes, it might earn him an 8-digit contract. Stranger things have happened. Does anybody remember Matt Flynn? For those who don't, Matt Flynn, he was back up to Aaron Rodgers in Green Bay. He, towards the end of his Green Bay tenure, he played some games for Rodgers. He had that one game against the Lions where he absolutely, just went off, and he had himself, a great performance. And then the Seahawks saw that and said, okay, we're going to assign you to a contract that you are definitely not worth based off, your limited amount of performance and everything else. But they did it anyway. It did not work out, as the Seahawks found out, and ended up trading him to the Raiders. And then Flynn would basically become a journeyman quarterback until about 2015, his last stop at the Saints, and now he's out of the NFL. Either way, Mayfield, right, I don't know what his career trajectory is after this, but I'll tell you what, I'm rooting for the guy. Let's see what you got, Mayfield. Maybe you can turn things around in LA, and maybe you can find a bit of a home there if you're content to be a QB2. Maybe there's some opportunities that open for you after this season. I guess we'll have to see how it goes. With that, we'll go ahead and wrap up this episode of NFL Discussion. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to hit that like button down below.